Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly into the dusty warmth of southern Egypt, where the sun rises slowly over a landscape that looks almost unchanged for thousands of years. The Nile glimmers nearby like a long ribbon of bronze, and somewhere along its banks a truly ridiculous idea is unfolding. Someone has decided to move a piece of stone taller than a 5-story building, weighing hundreds of tons, all the way down the river, at about the speed of a determined tortoise. You're here to watch it happen. In fact, if you linger long enough, you might even help. The air smells faintly of warm granite and river mud. Around you, the cliffs of Aswan glow pink in the early morning light. This is where many of ancient Egypt's obelisks begin their lives, inside the solid bedrock itself. You stand near a quarry where workers have been slowly carving a single massive pillar from the earth. It's already long enough to make your neck hurt when you look up its length. This thing will eventually stand in a temple courtyard, pointing neatly toward the sun like a stone finger reminding the heavens who's in charge. But right now, it's still lying peacefully in its rocky cradle, surrounded by dozens of men with copper chisels, stone hammers, and the kind of patience modern construction crews might envy or immediately abandon. Here comes the first reality check of the evening. You probably wouldn't last a day doing this job. Ancient Egyptian quarry work is slow, repetitive, and hot, very hot. The desert sun has a way of sitting on your shoulders like an overly affectionate cat made entirely of fire. Workers chip at the granite hour after hour, carefully cutting trenches around the stone until the long shaft of the obelisk begins to separate from the bedrock. Granite, by the way, is extremely stubborn. Copper tools are softer than granite, which means progress happens one small strike at a time. Workers often pound rounded dolerite stones against the surface, grinding away grooves with surprising efficiency. It's less like carving a statue and more like slowly convincing a mountain to cooperate. And yet, it works. Historians know that many obelisks were quarried right here in Aswan, some during the reigns of powerful pharaohs like Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. One unfinished obelisk still lies in the quarry today, abandoned after cracks appeared in the stone. If completed, it would have weighed over 1,000 tons. So yes, the Egyptians occasionally aimed a little high. Nearby, a scribe sits cross-legged with a reed pen and a small wooden palette of ink. His job is to record the workforce, track supplies, and probably make sure nobody mysteriously disappears during lunch break. Bureaucracy, it turns out, is one of humanity's most durable inventions. You wander a little closer to the stone itself. The obelisk is long and elegant even now, its sides roughly shaped but clearly recognizable. When finished, it will taper toward a pyramid-shaped tip called a pyramidion. That top section is sometimes coated in electrum, a glittering mix of gold and silver that catches the sunlight so brightly it can be seen from miles away. Imagine being a traveler approaching a temple and spotting that shining point flashing in the sun like a cosmic lighthouse. Ancient Egyptians associated obelisks with the sun god Ra. The tall, narrow shape symbolized a frozen ray of sunlight. In temple courtyards, obelisks stood in pairs, framing entrances and reflecting the divine power of the pharaoh who commissioned them. In other words, they were both religious symbols and extremely large royal bragging rights. A priest strolling through the quarry might explain it more poetically. He would say the obelisk connects earth and sky, anchoring divine energy into the temple grounds. You might quietly suspect it also connects the royal treasury to a very large construction bill. As the morning progresses, the quarry fills with rhythmic sounds, hammering, scraping, distant voices echoing off the rock walls. Workers pause occasionally to drink water or wipe sweat from their brows. Someone starts humming a slow work chant that gradually spreads through the group. Even ancient laborers appreciate a good rhythm when the day's work involves moving a mountain. One fascinating detail archaeologists discovered is that the Egyptians sometimes used wooden wedges to help separate the obelisk from the bedrock. They would hammer the wedges into cracks and then soak them with water. As the wood swelled, it created pressure that helped loosen the stone. It's simple physics, and surprisingly clever. Historians still argue whether this technique alone freed the obelisks or if additional cutting was always required. Either way, the process took months, sometimes years. You lean against a sun-warmed rock and watch as a team works along the base of the stone. Slowly, carefully, they deepen the final trench beneath it. The air grows quiet as the workers coordinate their movements. There's a sense that something important is about to happen. Eventually, after endless patient carving, the obelisk will separate completely from the bedrock. When that moment comes, it won't fall dramatically like a toppled tower. Instead, it will rest gently in a prepared channel, supported by stone ridges. The real adventure begins after that. Because freeing the obelisk is only step one. The next challenge is somehow transporting this colossal stone from the quarry down to the Nile River. The distance isn't enormous, roughly a few hundred meters in some cases, but when your cargo weighs hundreds of tons, even a short stroll becomes an engineering puzzle. You glance toward the river shimmering in the distance. Boats glide lazily along the water. Fishermen cast nets, and palm trees sway in the warm breeze. Everything about the Nile looks peaceful and unhurried. Which is perfect. Because the obelisk's journey will unfold at exactly that pace, slow, steady, and occasionally interrupted by someone yelling about ropes. Soon, hundreds of workers will gather to begin the next stage of the process. Wooden sledges will appear. Ropes thicker than your arm will be hauled into position. Sand will be poured. Water will be splashed, and a team of very determined humans will start dragging one of the heaviest objects on Earth toward the riverbank. And you, lucky observer that you are, will be walking right beside them, trying not to trip over history. For now though, the quarry hums quietly as the final cuts continue beneath the stone. The obelisk still rests partly within the earth, like a sleeping giant waiting for its long, slow trip north. The Nile glitters patiently in the distance. And the journey has only just begun. The morning grows warmer as you wander deeper into the quarry, where the obelisk's long granite body stretches across the stone floor like a sunbathing giant. Workers move around it with the calm rhythm of people who have done this many times before. Though the scale of the project still feels quietly unbelievable. A single pillar of stone, perhaps 20 meters long, will soon be traveling hundreds of kilometers down the Nile. At walking speed. No wheels, no steel cranes, no forklifts, not even a mildly encouraging motivational poster. Just copper tools, rope, wood, water, and an impressive amount of patience. You crouch near one end of the obelisk and run your fingers along the rough surface. The granite feels warm already, holding the desert sun like a slowly heating stovetop. Small grooves and hammer marks cover the stone where workers have been shaping its sides. This particular granite, quarried from Aswan, is famous throughout Egyptian history. It has a distinctive pinkish hue caused by minerals like feldspar and quartz. When polished, it becomes incredibly smooth and reflective, which is exactly what the ancient Egyptians wanted. Many of the most famous monuments in Egypt, including obelisks, statues, and temple columns, were carved from this same stone. It was durable, beautiful, and, perhaps most importantly, impressively difficult to work with. Nothing says eternal royal power quite like choosing the most stubborn rock available. Around you, teams of quarry workers continue shaping the sides of the obelisk. They use rounded dolerite pounding stones, dense, dark rocks that function like prehistoric jackhammers. With steady swings, they strike the granite repeatedly, chipping away small fragments and gradually smoothing the surface. The sound echoes through the quarry in a slow percussion. Thud, thud, thud. If ancient Egypt had a construction soundtrack, this would probably be track number 1. A foreman walks past carrying a wooden staff, scanning the work with a practiced eye. Overseers like him played an important role in Egyptian labor projects, Contrary to old Hollywood movies, most large state construction in Egypt was done not by enslaved populations but by organized laborers, skilled workers, farmers during flood seasons, and craftsmen employed by the state. Historians still debate the exact makeup of these crews, but many believe they were paid in rations like bread, beer, onions, and dried fish. Honestly, not the worst lunch menu in history. Nearby, a small group of workers kneels along the base of the obelisk, widening the trench that separates it from the bedrock. The gap beneath the stone is narrow but growing. The goal is to free the entire length without cracking it, an outcome that would cause several months of extremely awkward meetings with royal officials. You notice a worker sliding a wooden wedge into one of the carved gaps. Here comes that clever trick again. After hammering the wedge into place, another worker pours water over it. The dry wood slowly absorbs the moisture and begins to expand. As it swells, it pushes against the granite walls of the crack. Tiny, steady pressure builds. Over time, the expanding wood helps loosen the stone's connection to the bedrock. The Egyptians likely used dozens, sometimes hundreds, of these wedges in combination with careful chiseling. Historians still argue whether swelling wedges alone could detach something as massive as an obelisk, or if the final separation required extensive manual cutting beneath the stone. Either way, the method worked often enough to produce dozens of standing obelisks across Egypt. You shift your gaze toward the far end of the quarry. There lies one of the most fascinating reminders of ancient ambition, the famous unfinished obelisk. Even from here you can see the enormous shape carved directly into the rock floor. It's larger than the one beside you, and a deep crack runs along its surface. That crack ended the entire project. When quarry workers discovered the flaw, they had to abandon the stone where it lay. If completed, it would have been the largest obelisk ever attempted, over 40 meters long and weighing roughly 1.200 tons, which is roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded Boeing 747 airplanes. So yes, the Egyptians occasionally swung for the fences. A group of workers nearby pauses for a break, sitting in the shade of a temporary awning made from linen cloths stretched over wooden poles. One man unwraps a small loaf of bread while another pours beer from a clay jar. Egyptian beer, by the way, was thicker and more nutritious than modern versions, closer to a grainy barley drink than a crisp lager. It was a daily staple, consumed by nearly everyone from farmers to priests. You briefly consider that if construction sites today served unlimited beer at lunch, productivity might decline slightly. The workers laugh and talk quietly, glancing now and then toward the obelisk as if checking on a sleeping animal. And in a way, that's exactly what it feels like. The stone lies silent and massive, waiting for the moment it will finally be freed. The sun climbs higher, heat ripples through the air. Somewhere above, a hawk circles lazily against the blue sky. Eventually the foreman claps his hands, signaling the end of the break. Workers rise and return to their stations with calm determination. The pounding stones resume their rhythm. Thud, thud, thud. Hour after hour, the trench beneath the obelisk deepens. Small teams crawl carefully beneath the edges, widening the channel that separates the stone from the quarry floor. It's delicate work. A careless strike could damage the monument, and granite has an unfortunate tendency to crack at the worst possible moment. You notice scribes occasionally measuring the stone with cords and rods. Precision matters. Egyptian engineers understood geometry well, and obelisks needed straight sides and perfect symmetry to stand correctly later. No one wants a slightly crooked sunray monument. As afternoon approaches, something changes. The trench beneath the obelisk has reached its final depth. Wooden beams are positioned carefully along its sides. Workers begin sliding supporting blocks beneath key points of the stone. A quiet tension spreads through the quarry. You realize they're preparing for the moment when the obelisk finally separates from the bedrock entirely. Not dramatically, Not with a thunderous crash, but with a slow, almost polite release. The workers coordinate their movements carefully. More wedges are hammered into place. Water is poured again. Teams push wooden levers against the stone. Then, almost imperceptibly, the obelisk shifts. A soft grinding sound passes through the granite. Dust drifts upward. The giant has come loose. It now rests fully on its prepared supports, free from the rock that held it for millions of years. No cheering erupts, no trumpets sound, just a few quiet nods between workers. After all, everyone here knows something important. Freeing the obelisk is only the beginning. Tomorrow, or perhaps the next day, the real challenge begins. Because now this enormous piece of granite needs to travel from the quarry to the Nile River, without breaking, without tipping, and preferably without flattening anyone along the way. You glance toward the distant water again. The river sparkles calmly, as if completely unconcerned that it's about to host one of the slowest heavy transport operations in human history. And soon, hundreds of people will gather with ropes, sledges, and enough determination to drag a stone mountain across the sand. Good thing you're here to watch. Or, possibly pull. The newly freed obelisk rests quietly on its stone supports, stretching across the quarry floor like a patient sunbeam carved from the earth. Workers move around it with the careful respect usually reserved for large animals that could accidentally sit on you. The air has shifted. Before, the quarry was all noise and pounding stone. Now the atmosphere carries a quieter energy, the kind that settles over a place when one enormous task has ended and another, perhaps even more ridiculous one, is about to begin. Because carving the obelisk was the easy part. Moving it is where things become interesting. A small group of priests arrives from the nearby temple settlement just after midday. Their linen robes glow almost white in the sunlight, and they walk with the calm confidence of men who are extremely comfortable speaking for the gods. One priest pauses near the base of the obelisk, brushing a little quarry dust from the granite surface with surprising gentleness. He murmurs a brief prayer, placing a small offering of incense beside the stone. You might assume this is simply ceremonial politeness, but in ancient Egypt the obelisk carried deep spiritual meaning. These towering monuments were associated with the sun god Ra and the concept of the Benben, the mythical mound that, according to Egyptian creation stories, rose from the primordial waters at the beginning of time. The obelisk's tall shape symbolized a ray of sunlight frozen in stone. Essentially, this giant granite pillar is a spiritual antenna pointing directly at the heavens. And if you're thinking that sounds suspiciously poetic for what is basically an extremely large stick of rock, you're not alone. But the symbolism mattered deeply to the Egyptians. Temples often placed obelisks in pairs at their entrances, creating monumental gateways aligned with the sun's path. When sunlight struck the pyramid-shaped tip, the pyramidion, it reflected brilliantly if coated in electrum. That gleaming alloy of gold and silver. Ancient travelers approaching a temple might see the tip glowing from miles away. Imagine a sunrise catching that polished metal point, flashing like a tiny captured star. Not bad advertising for divine authority. The pharaoh, of course, received a generous share of the credit. Obelisks were usually inscribed with hieroglyphs praising the ruler who commissioned them. Think of them as extremely durable press releases carved in stone. Pharaoh so-and-so, beloved of Ra, ruler of the two lands. Definitely worth remembering forever. Subtle messaging was not a major feature of royal monuments. A scribe nearby carefully unrolls a papyrus scroll while discussing measurements with one of the overseers. Transporting the obelisk requires planning that would make modern logistics managers nod in appreciation. Every step must be organized. The workers pulling the sledges, the ropes used for dragging, the path cleared toward the Nile, and the wooden barge waiting to carry the stone north. The whole operation is less like construction and more like organizing the world's slowest parade float. You stroll alongside the obelisk again, noticing how precisely its sides have been shaped. Even at this early stage, the symmetry is impressive. Egyptian artisans understood proportion extremely well. Historians know that many obelisks were later polished to an almost mirror-like surface using sand and abrasive stones. The final result could shine brilliantly in sunlight. But before any polishing happens, the stone needs to survive its upcoming trip. Nearby, several workers begin assembling something that looks like a giant wooden sled. Thick timber beams are fitted together with wooden pegs and lashings. The structure is broad, flat, and reinforced to distribute weight. This sled will cradle the obelisk as it travels across the ground. The idea is simple. Instead of trying to roll the stone, an activity that would likely end with someone shouting and running away, you slide it. Ancient Egyptians were masters of sliding extremely heavy things. There's even a famous tomb painting showing a colossal statue being pulled on a sled by dozens of workers while one person pours water onto the sand in front of it. At first glance, it looks like someone spilled their drink. But modern experiments show this technique works brilliantly. When sand is slightly wet, the grains stick together just enough to reduce friction. The sled glides more smoothly, meaning fewer workers are needed to pull massive loads. Historians still debate exactly how often this trick was used, but evidence suggests the Egyptians understood the effect quite well. Which is good news for your future back muscles. A foreman calls out instructions as teams begin clearing a pathway through the quarry entrance. Loose stones are removed, wooden rollers and planks are stacked nearby. Ropes thicker than your wrist are coiled carefully along the ground. These ropes are typically made from plant fibers like papyrus or palm, twisted into strong cords capable of handling enormous strain. You test one experimentally with your foot. It feels sturdy enough to tow a small house. A group of younger workers arrives carrying wooden poles that will act as guiding levers during the move. Their job will be to help steer the sled and keep the obelisk balanced. Steering, of course, is a polite way of saying, desperately trying to prevent 300 tons of granite from wandering off the path. Meanwhile, the priests continue their quiet rituals beside the stone. One sprinkles a little water while murmuring a blessing. Another burns incense that drifts lazily into the desert air. Religion and engineering mix comfortably in ancient Egypt. If you're going to move a sacred sun ray monument, you might as well ask the sun god to keep an eye on things. Historians still argue whether these ceremonies were primarily symbolic or if workers genuinely believed divine protection was necessary for such dangerous tasks. Most likely, it was a bit of both. A little spiritual insurance never hurts when gravity is involved. As afternoon shadows grow longer, the sled is finally ready. Workers gather around the obelisk, studying it like a group of sailors examining a sleeping whale. Thick ropes are attached to the sled's front beams. Wooden supports are adjusted carefully beneath the stone. Tomorrow, they will attempt the first short movement, sliding the obelisk from its resting supports onto the sled itself. It sounds simple. It is absolutely not simple. Even shifting the stone a few centimeters requires careful coordination. Too much force in one direction could crack the granite or tip the sled. Too little force and the monument simply refuses to move, like a stubborn donkey that has decided today is not a workday. The sun begins to sink toward the western desert, painting the quarry walls with deep orange light. Workers gradually pack up their tools and head back toward the settlement near the river. The quarry grows quiet again, leaving the obelisk resting beneath the fading sky. You linger a moment longer beside it. Tomorrow this giant stone will begin its slow journey toward the Nile. A journey that will involve hundreds of people, miles of rope, and just enough engineering brilliance to move a mountain, very, very slowly. The river waits patiently in the distance, glimmering under the last light of day. And somewhere out there, a very large boat is already being prepared. Morning returns to the quarry with a gentle blaze of sunlight spilling over the granite cliffs. The obelisk still lies quietly on its supports, looking exactly as enormous as it did yesterday. Possibly even a little more enormous now that you've had time to think about what's coming next. Because today is the day the workforce arrives. Not just a few dozen quarry workers. Hundreds. From the path leading up from the Nile, you begin to see them appearing in small groups, men carrying ropes, wooden poles, tools, baskets of water, and the calm determination of people who know their entire morning will involve persuading an extremely heavy object to cooperate. Ancient Egyptian state projects were often impressively organized. Pharaohs could mobilize large labor forces, especially during the annual Nile flood season when farmland was underwater and farmers were temporarily free from planting duties. Historians believe many monument building crews were made up of these seasonal workers. Instead of farming for a few months, they helped construct temples, carve stone, or, today's activity, drag a granite skyscraper toward the river. In return, they received rations, housing, and occasionally a decent reputation for participating in royal projects. Not bad for a seasonal job, though the dress code does appear to be linen kilt and optimism. You watch as the workers spread out across the quarry floor. Overseers move among them with staffs and clipboards, well, not literal clipboards, but papyrus scrolls that serve much the same purpose. Scribes squat nearby, recording attendance and supplies with neat lines of hieratic script. Bureaucracy hums quietly alongside the muscle work. Even in ancient Egypt, someone had to fill out the paperwork. The sled that workers assembled yesterday now sits directly beside the obelisk. Up close, it's even more impressive. Thick wooden beams lashed tightly together, reinforced underneath to distribute the weight. The design resembles a giant wooden tray with raised edges to cradle the stone. The goal today is to shift the obelisk onto this sled without cracking it, or anyone's toes. Workers begin positioning wooden rollers and wedges beneath the stone. Others bring long wooden levers, placing them carefully along the sides. Ropes are attached to strategic points on the sled so that pulling teams can control the movement. It looks less like construction and more like an elaborate group exercise in patience. A foreman climbs onto a rock and raises his staff. Everyone pauses. He shouts instructions that echo across the quarry. Teams take their positions along the ropes, lining up in rows like a tug-of-war competition where the opponent happens to weigh several hundred tons. You notice one man stepping forward with a jar of water. He pours it onto the sand in front of the sled. At first, it seems oddly ceremonial, perhaps some mysterious desert hydration ritual, but then another worker spreads the damp sand evenly across the path. Here's that clever trick again. Modern experiments have confirmed that wet sand reduces friction dramatically when dragging heavy sleds. The water helps bind the grains together, preventing them from piling up in front of the sled. Instead of plowing through loose sand like a snowplow, the sled glides across a firmer surface. Historians still debate whether the Egyptians fully understood the physics involved or simply discovered the effect through experience. Either way, it worked. And today, you're very grateful for it. The foreman gives another shout. Workers lean into the ropes. The first pull begins. At first, nothing happens. The sled creaks softly, the ropes tighten, muscles strain, sand shifts beneath bare feet. For a moment, the obelisk seems perfectly content to remain exactly where it has been for the last few million years. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stone moves. A soft grinding sound echoes through the quarry. The obelisk slides forward a few centimeters. A cheer ripples through the crowd, not loud, just a satisfied murmur. Progress in ancient engineering often arrives in very small increments. Pull again. The ropes tighten once more. The sled shifts slightly as the obelisk's weight begins transferring onto it. Workers use levers to guide the stone gently into position. Wooden wedges are adjusted quickly to keep everything balanced. This is delicate work. Granite may be strong, but under uneven pressure it can crack unexpectedly. And if a 300-ton obelisk snaps in half, someone will have a very awkward conversation with the pharaoh. Gradually, steadily, the monument settles onto the sled. Dust rises, wood creaks, the sled's beams groan under the incredible weight, but they hold. The obelisk now rests fully on the transport platform. Congratulations! You've just completed the world's slowest loading process. But the real journey hasn't even started yet. Workers immediately begin preparing the pulling teams for the next phase, dragging the sled from the quarry down toward the Nile River. The path has already been cleared in advance, loose rocks removed, sand smoothed, small ramps built to help guide the sled downhill. Even so, the trip will take hours, possibly all day. A priest returns briefly to offer another small blessing, sprinkling water and murmuring a prayer to Ra. The workers listen respectfully, though a few glance nervously at the sled as if hoping divine assistance includes structural support. You take a position near one of the rope lines. A worker beside you nods and gestures toward the rope in silent invitation. Apparently, today you're part of the workforce. Don't worry. No one expects heroic strength. The pulling teams rely on sheer numbers more than individual power. Hundreds of people working together can move astonishingly heavy loads. Still, you tighten your grip and plant your feet in the sand. The foreman raises his staff again. Pull. The ropes stretch forward as hundreds of workers lean into the effort. The sled groans loudly this time, the sound of ancient timber negotiating with gravity. And then the entire monument begins sliding slowly across the quarry floor. The movement is steady, almost graceful. Sand shifts smoothly beneath the sled as workers pour more water along the path ahead. Step by step, pull by pull, the obelisk creeps toward the quarry entrance. It's not fast. It's not dramatic. But it works. You glance back once more at the granite cliffs where the obelisk spent millions of years resting inside the earth. Now it's finally moving. Down toward the Nile. Toward the river that will carry it north across Egypt. And judging by the pace so far, you might want to get comfortable. This journey is going to take a while. The rope presses rough fibers into your palms as the pulling teams lean forward again. Around you, dozens of workers step in rhythm, their sandals scraping softly against damp sand. The sled creaks like an old ship, but it keeps sliding forward, inch by patient inch. Behind you, the quarry walls slowly drift farther away. Ahead lies the Nile. You would think dragging a several hundred-ton obelisk across sand would look chaotic. But the opposite is true. Everything moves with a surprising calm. Workers pull in coordinated bursts. Overseers shout occasional adjustments. The man with the water jar keeps walking ahead of the sled, splashing damp patches along the path like a very focused gardener watering the desert. And yes, this job might officially be called professional sand sprinkler. A surprisingly important one. Modern studies suggest that properly wetting the sand could reduce friction by nearly half. Without that trick, the sled might sink into loose grains like a spoon in flour. With it, the sled glides over the surface with much less resistance. Historians still argue about how systematically this method was used across Egypt. But tomb paintings strongly suggest it was common knowledge among workers. Ancient engineering sometimes looks simple until you realize how elegantly clever it is. The obelisk moves another few meters. You glance sideways at the stone resting on the sled. Up close, its scale is still quietly intimidating. The granite shaft stretches longer than several houses lined end to end. Its sides only roughly shaped but already showing the elegant taper that will eventually guide the eye toward the sky. For now, though, it's lying perfectly horizontal, like a giant pencil waiting to be sharpened by the sun. Workers along the sides walk with long wooden poles, gently nudging the sled whenever it drifts slightly off course. Steering something this heavy is less about turning and more about convincing it not to wander. Think of it like guiding a very sleepy elephant that only responds to teamwork. A scribe walks beside the procession, occasionally stopping to make notes on his papyrus. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. Labor forces, supply deliveries, and progress reports were often documented carefully. Some surviving papyri from later periods even record daily work logs for government crews. Which means somewhere in the distant past, a scribe may have written something like, "Moved giant stone 3 cubits today. Everyone very tired. Sand slightly damp." Around midday, the workers pause briefly for a rest. The sled remains stationary while teams sit in the thin shade cast by temporary awnings and the obelisk itself. Yes, the stone now doubles as the world's least portable umbrella. Clay jars of water are passed around. Bread and dried fish appear from baskets. Someone pours thick barley beer into small cups. You notice that despite the hard labor, the mood feels oddly relaxed. People talk, laugh, stretch their shoulders. Large state projects in Egypt often fostered strong community among workers. Archaeologists studying labor villages, like those used for pyramid builders, have found evidence of organized housing, medical care, and even occasional days off. In other words, the workforce wasn't simply disposable labor. Though today, everyone's back muscles may feel otherwise. One worker jokes that if the pharaoh truly loved the sun god, he could simply send Ra a letter instead of hauling granite across half the country. The others laugh quietly. Even ancient construction crews enjoy mild sarcasm. After the short break, the pulling teams gather again. Ropes tighten. Sand is dampened ahead. The foreman signals another coordinated effort. The sled begins moving once more. Gradually the quarry entrance approaches. The ground slopes gently downward toward the river valley, which is both helpful and slightly terrifying. Gravity, after all, can be a very enthusiastic assistant. Workers along the sides pay close attention as the sled moves down the incline. Wooden chocks are placed behind the runners whenever the team pauses, preventing the monument from deciding to take an unscheduled sprint downhill. Historians believe such safety measures were common, though no ancient document specifically describes the moment when someone shouted, "Maybe we should put a block behind that." Common sense tends to invent itself quickly around giant rocks. You reach the edge of the quarry path and suddenly the view opens wide. There it is. The Nile stretches across the landscape in a shimmering ribbon of blue-green water, bordered by palm trees and fertile fields. Boats drift lazily along its current, their sails catching the warm breeze. The contrast is striking. Behind you lies the harsh desert quarry. Ahead lies the life-giving river that made Egyptian civilization possible. And today, it's about to host a very unusual delivery. The sled inches down the final slope toward the riverbank. Workers move carefully, keeping tension on the ropes to control the descent. Even with friction and chocks, a 300-ton stone object has strong opinions about gravity. Finally, after hours of steady effort, the sled reaches a flat clearing beside the Nile. The pulling teams stop. For a moment, everyone simply stands there catching their breath. The obelisk now rests only a short distance from the water's edge. You follow the line of the river with your eyes. Boats pass slowly in the current. Fishermen cast nets from narrow reed vessels. Children splash along the shallows while ibis birds pick their way through the mud. And anchored just offshore, waiting patiently, floats something rather extraordinary. A barge. Not a small fishing boat. A wide, heavy wooden vessel built specifically to carry cargo like this. Cargo measured not in crates or sacks but in entire monuments. Its deck sits low in the water, and several crew members move about adjusting ropes and poles. Shipbuilders and sailors have clearly been preparing for this moment. because the next challenge is perhaps the trickiest of all. Somehow, this massive obelisk must be loaded onto that barge without dropping it into the Nile, snapping it in half, or accidentally inventing the world's largest fishing sinker. You glance back at the sled, then out at the waiting boat. The quarry journey may be finished, but the river journey is about to begin. And if you thought dragging a granite tower across the desert was complicated, just wait until you see how they put it on a boat. The Nile laps softly against the muddy bank while the obelisk rests on its sled nearby, as if pausing to admire the river before boarding its extremely slow cruise north. After hours of dragging granite through the desert, the sight of water feels almost luxurious. Palm trees sway gently, boats drift in the current. Somewhere upstream, a fisherman shouts at a stubborn net, and directly ahead floats the barge that will carry your oversized passenger. Up close, the vessel looks less like a typical riverboat and more like a floating wooden platform. Its hull is broad and sturdy, built to distribute an enormous load across the water. Thick timbers form the deck, and tall steering oars extend from the stern like giant wooden paddles. Shipbuilders move across the deck making final adjustments, tightening ropes and checking support beams. Ancient Egyptian river barges could be surprisingly sophisticated. Some cargo vessels were built specifically for heavy transport, with reinforced hulls and wide flat decks capable of supporting statues, columns, and, on ambitious days, entire obelisks. Historians know that Queen Hatshepsut once transported a pair of massive obelisks down the Nile during her reign in the 15th century BCE. Relief carvings from her temple at Deir el-Bahri even depict the enormous barge used for the operation, escorted by multiple smaller boats. If the artwork is accurate, that vessel may have been over 60 meters long. In other words, the Egyptians occasionally built ships the size of small office buildings. You watch as workers begin preparing the loading ramp between land and barge. Thick wooden beams are stacked carefully to form a gradual slope from the riverbank to the deck. Mud and sand are packed between the planks to create a stable surface. The plan is beautifully simple. Instead of lifting the obelisk onto the barge, which would require cranes that don't exist, the workers will slide it aboard. Just like everything else in this project, sliding, it turns out, is the unsung hero of ancient engineering. The sled carrying the obelisk is repositioned slowly until it lines up with the ramp. Workers push and lever the platform a few centimeters at a time, adjusting its angle with impressive patience. Nearby, a group of sailors wades into the shallow water beside the barge, checking that the vessel is properly balanced. Large mooring ropes stretch from the boat to wooden stakes driven deep into the riverbank. The barge must remain perfectly stable during the loading process. Otherwise, things could become splashy. Historians still argue about the exact techniques Egyptians used to load monuments like this onto ships. Some scholars suggest temporary canals or basins were dug so vessels could float closer to the quarry site. Others believe large ramps and careful ballast adjustments were enough. Either way, the principle remains the same. Move the stone slowly, control every shift in weight, and pray that gravity behaves politely. The foreman signals the workers again. Pulling teams gather along the ropes. And once more, the great granite monument begins to move. The sled slides forward toward the ramp. Wood creaks loudly as the runners meet the first planks. The angle is slight, but you can immediately feel the extra resistance as gravity pushes back. Several workers run ahead with jars of water, dampening the ramp's surface. Even on wood, reducing friction is helpful when your cargo weighs several hundred tons. The pulling teams lean forward together. The sled climbs the ramp, slowly, steadily. For a moment, it feels like watching a glacier move uphill. The barge shifts slightly in the water as the sled approaches its edge. Sailors shout quick instructions while adjusting the mooring ropes. The vessel dips a little under the growing weight, but it holds. Step by careful step, the obelisk inches closer to the deck. You notice a group of workers stationed along the sides with thick ropes attached to the monument itself. Their job is to stabilize the stone, preventing any sideways movement during the transfer. No one wants the obelisk deciding to explore the Nile independently. The sled reaches the midpoint of the ramp. Everyone pauses. Foremen check the alignment. Sailors inspect the barge's balance. Wooden wedges are hammered into place beneath the runners to hold the load steady while adjustments are made. This entire process is less about strength and more about patience. Even modern heavy transport teams follow the same philosophy: slow movement, constant checks, no rushing. Eventually, the signal is given again. The ropes tighten. The sled moves forward another meter. Now the front runners slide directly onto the barge's deck. The ship dips noticeably under the weight, but the hull spreads the load across the water just as intended. The Nile quietly accepts the burden. Ancient engineers understood buoyancy well, even if they didn't use that particular word. More pulling, more creaking wood. Gradually, the entire sled crosses onto the barge. The monument is aboard. A low cheer ripples through the workers along the riverbank. Not a loud celebration. Egyptian laborers were practical people, but a satisfied recognition that the most dangerous part of the operation has succeeded. The obelisk now rests securely on the vessel, supported by thick wooden braces that prevent rolling or shifting during the voyage. You step onto the barge carefully, feeling the deck sway gently beneath your feet. The river carries a faint breeze across the water, bringing with it the earthy smell of reeds and silt. Around you, sailors begin preparing the vessel for departure. Large square sails are checked, steering oars are tested, smaller escort boats drift nearby, ready to assist if needed. Because while the Nile current will help carry the barge northward, controlling a massive floating monument still requires skilled navigation. The river, after all, has sandbanks, shifting channels, and the occasional curious crocodile. Historians still debate exactly how long journeys like this took, depending on the distance and conditions. Transporting an obelisk from Aswan to northern temple cities could take several weeks. At what you might politely call leisurely monument speed. The sun begins dipping lower toward the western horizon as preparations continue. The barge rocks gently under the weight of its cargo, but everything remains stable. The granite pillar lies quietly across the deck, pointing toward the bow like a giant stone compass. Tomorrow the vessel will set sail with the current. The desert quarry now lies behind you. Ahead stretches the long green corridor of the Nile, Egypt's ancient highway. And somewhere far downstream, temple courtyards are waiting for the arrival of a monument that has already traveled from bedrock to river. Soon, it will glide north on the slowest luxury cruise in ancient engineering history. You find a spot along the rail and watch the sunset paint the water gold. The journey has changed from dragging to drifting. But the pace? Still very, very patient. Morning on the Nile arrives gently. A pale golden light spreads across the river's surface, turning the slow current into something that looks like liquid honey. The barge rocks softly beneath your feet, its enormous cargo resting across the deck like a granite passenger that refuses to buy a ticket. Around you, sailors begin their day with quiet efficiency. Ropes are checked. The square linen sail is unfurled halfway, catching a light breeze drifting northward. Nearby escort boats drift into position like polite bodyguards escorting a very important celebrity made entirely of stone. The obelisk, for its part, remains wonderfully calm about the entire situation. It lies securely on thick wooden supports, lashed down with ropes that could probably restrain an enthusiastic elephant. Workers have placed padded wooden blocks along its sides to prevent shifting as the vessel moves. After all, if a 300-ton monument decides to roll, the Nile will suddenly gain the world's most dramatic paperweight. You walk across the barge's wide deck, noticing how carefully everything has been arranged. Egyptian shipbuilders understood that balance mattered enormously when transporting heavy cargo. The obelisk lies precisely along the center line of the vessel, distributing its weight evenly. Historians know that the Egyptians were excellent boat builders. The Nile was their highway, their trade route, their supply chain, and occasionally their floating construction platform. Wood for large ships was relatively scarce in Egypt, so builders often imported cedar from Lebanon. This durable timber made strong hulls and long beams capable of supporting heavy loads. Which is fortunate, because today your barge is carrying something roughly equivalent to several fully loaded modern trucks. A sailor near the stern calls out as the crew prepares to cast off the mooring ropes. The stakes holding the vessel to the riverbank are loosened. Poles push gently against the mud to nudge the barge away from shore. Slowly, almost lazily, the vessel drifts into the current. The Nile takes hold. Unlike many rivers, the Nile flows steadily north toward the Mediterranean Sea. Ancient Egyptians cleverly used this natural system for transportation. Sailboats could travel south by catching the prevailing winds, while drifting with the current carried them north. It's a beautifully convenient setup. Today, the current does most of the work. The barge glides forward with a quiet ripple of water along its hull. The sail catches a little breeze, adding gentle momentum. You glance back toward the riverbank where the sled and ramps remain behind. Workers wave briefly before turning back toward their tasks on land. Their part of the job is done. Now the river crew takes over. As the vessel drifts north, the landscape begins to change. The barren desert cliffs of Aswan slowly fade behind you, replaced by fertile fields lining the Nile's banks. Farmers tend crops of barley, wheat, and flax in the rich black soil left behind by the annual flood. Palm groves cluster near villages of mud brick houses. Children run along the riverbank shouting excitedly at the passing boats. And they definitely notice your boat. A floating granite monument is not exactly subtle. One boy points toward the obelisk with wide eyes while his friends stare in amazement. From their perspective, it probably looks like someone accidentally placed a skyscraper sideways on a boat. You can't really blame them. The barge moves steadily with the current, covering several kilometers before midday. Sailors occasionally adjust the sail or use long steering oars to keep the vessel centered in the river channel. The Nile may seem calm, but it hides plenty of shallow sandbanks. Running aground with a cargo like this would be inconvenient. Historians still debate how often ancient transport ships encountered such problems. Some scholars believe escort boats played a key role, scouting ahead for safe routes through shifting riverbeds. Either way, the pilots guiding this vessel clearly know the river well. Around midday, the crew relaxes slightly as the journey settles into a rhythm. A cooking pot is hung over a small clay hearth on deck, where someone prepares a simple stew of lentils and onions. The smell drifts pleasantly across the barge. You sit near the obelisk's base while sailors share bread and dried fish. One of them pats the granite surface affectionately. "Quiet passenger," he jokes. Honestly, it's the easiest cargo they've ever transported. No complaints, no sudden movements, no requests for extra blankets. Just several hundred tons of silent cooperation. As the afternoon breeze strengthens, the sail fills more fully. The barge glides faster now, though faster in this context still means something closer to a leisurely bicycle ride. Perhaps 3 or 4 kilometers per hour. Monument speed. You watch the shoreline drift past like a slow painting. Reeds sway in the wind. White birds lift lazily from the water. Fishermen pull in nets shimmering with silver fish. And occasionally, a darker shape slides silently beneath the surface. Crocodiles live throughout the Nile, though they tend to avoid large boats. Still, one sailor keeps a watchful eye whenever ripples appear near the hull. Ancient Egyptians respected these animals deeply. The crocodile god Sobek represented strength, fertility, and the power of the Nile itself. You quietly suspect Sobig might also appreciate a snack the size of a distracted sailor. But today the river remains peaceful. The barge drifts onward under the warm sun, carrying its extraordinary cargo toward distant temple cities. Scribes on board occasionally measure progress using simple distance estimates and river landmarks. Keeping track of the journey helps coordinate arrival with temple officials further downstream. After all, receiving an obelisk requires preparation. Very large preparation. Late in the afternoon, the barge approaches a narrow bend where the river curves gently between low hills. The current quickens slightly, and the pilots adjust the steering oars carefully. The monument shifts almost imperceptibly on its supports, but the ropes hold firm. Everything remains steady. The crew relaxes again as the river straightens beyond the bend. The sail flutters softly overhead while the current carries you farther north. Behind you lies the quarry where the obelisk was born. Ahead lie the temples where it will stand for centuries. For now, though, the monument simply rides the river, enjoying perhaps the slowest sightseeing cruise in ancient history. And you have the perfect seat on deck to watch the Nile roll gently past. The barge continues drifting north, the Nile carrying it with a steady, almost hypnotic rhythm. Water curls quietly along the hull while the wide linen sail billows gently overhead. Somewhere behind you the granite quarries of Aswan have faded into the southern haze. And ahead the river winds through Egypt like a long green road. Life on board quickly settles into a calm routine. Which is fortunate, because transporting an obelisk is not exactly a fast adventure. You stretch your legs along the deck beside the monument, which remains lashed securely to thick wooden braces. Sailors occasionally check the ropes, tightening a knot here or shifting a support block there. When your cargo weighs several hundred tons, paranoia becomes a healthy professional habit. The crew seems comfortable around the stone now. One sailor even uses the base of the obelisk as a convenient seat while repairing a frayed rope. Technically, he is sitting on what will someday be a sacred solar monument. But at the moment it also makes a perfectly good bench. The morning sun climbs higher, warming the riverbanks where fields stretch out in vibrant green patches. Farmers guide wooden plows pulled by oxen through the dark, fertile soil. That soil, called Kemet, meaning black land, came from the Nile's annual floods. Every year the river overflowed its banks, spreading nutrient-rich silt across the fields before slowly retreating again. Without that cycle, Egyptian civilization simply wouldn't exist. The river is not just scenery. It's the entire system. Historians estimate that by the New Kingdom period, millions of people lived along the Nile Valley, relying on its floods to grow crops like wheat, barley, onions, and flax. Watching the farmers work from the deck, you realize the entire country flows past like a slow-moving panorama. Villages appear every few kilometers, clusters of mud brick homes with flat roofs and narrow lanes. Palm groves provide shade while goats wander lazily between houses. Children run down to the riverbank when they spot your barge approaching. Again, the obelisk gets their attention immediately. One boy cups his hands around his mouth and shouts something excitedly toward the crew. You can't quite hear the words, but judging by the laughter from the sailors, it's probably a question along the lines of, "Why is there a giant rock on your boat?" Honestly, it's a fair question. The barge glides onward, its progress helped by both current and wind. The square sail flutters occasionally as sailors adjust its ropes, known as sheets. Ancient Egyptian sailing technology was simple but effective. Most river vessels used a single large square sail mounted on a central mast, which could be raised or lowered depending on wind conditions. Steering came from massive oars mounted at the stern, operated by experienced pilots who knew the river's twists and shallows. Those pilots now stand watchfully near the back of the vessel. One of them scans the water ahead, searching for subtle color changes that might reveal sandbanks lurking just below the surface. The Nile shifts constantly. Channels deepen or disappear with each flood season. Historians still argue how ancient navigators tracked these changes so effectively. Some believe pilots memorized landmarks and river patterns over decades of experience. Others suspect local guides from riverside villages occasionally helped direct traffic. Either way, the man steering your floating monument clearly knows what he's doing. Because steering a normal cargo boat is one thing. Steering a cargo boat carrying a sideways skyscraper is quite another. Around midday, the crew prepares a simple meal. Clay jars of water are passed around, along with bread and dates. Someone roasts small fish over a charcoal brazier near the bow. You sit beside the obelisk again, enjoying the breeze while the river slides quietly past. One sailor taps the granite thoughtfully. "Imagine carving this whole thing by hand," he says. You glance along the polished sides and silently agree. Granite is incredibly hard. Even with modern equipment, it takes effort to shape it. Ancient craftsmen using copper tools and stone hammers needed remarkable patience and skill. Historians estimate that quarrying and shaping a single large obelisk could take many months, sometimes over a year. Transporting it was just the middle chapter. The final stage, raising it upright in a temple courtyard, will require even more ingenuity. But that challenge lies further down the river. For now, the barge drifts peacefully under a bright sky. The afternoon grows warmer, and the crew settles into quiet tasks, repairing ropes, adjusting cargo supports, and occasionally glancing toward the riverbanks where wildlife appears. A flock of white egrets lifts from the reeds as the boat passes. Turtles sun themselves on muddy rocks before sliding lazily into the water. And once, not far from the stern, a long dark shape glides beneath the surface. A crocodile. It surfaces briefly, eyes and nostrils breaking the water like a floating log with opinions. Then it sinks again, disappearing into the murky depths. The sailors watch calmly. Crocodiles were common along the Nile, especially in ancient times. Egyptians respected them deeply, worshipping the crocodile god Sobek in several regions. Temples dedicated to Sobek even kept sacred crocodiles in pools, feeding and adorning them with jewelry. You imagine explaining that to someone today? Yes, we worship the giant river lizard and occasionally give it necklaces. Religion, like engineering, had its own unique logic. As the afternoon stretches toward evening, the river bends gently westward. The pilots adjust the steering oars to keep the barge aligned with the strongest current. Wind rustles the sail again, pushing the vessel forward at a steady pace. By sunset, you've traveled dozens of kilometers downstream. The sky turns orange and purple above the palm-lined banks. Smoke rises from village cooking fires while distant temple pylons appear briefly on the horizon before fading into twilight. Somewhere out there, priests and builders are preparing courtyards that will eventually host monuments like the one resting beside you. But tonight the obelisk simply sleeps on deck. The barge anchors near a quiet stretch of riverbank. Sailors secure the ropes while others prepare bedding from rolled mats. The Nile reflects the stars above like scattered silver coins. And your giant stone companion remains perfectly still, continuing its slow, patient journey toward a place where someday it will stand upright beneath the sun. For now, though, drifting gently on the river is more than enough adventure. Dawn rises softly over the Nile once again, and you wake to the quiet sounds of river life returning to motion. Birds chatter in the reeds. Water laps gently against the hull of the barge. Somewhere along the shoreline, a donkey makes a complaint about being awake this early. The obelisk, as always, remains the calmest traveler on board, while the sailors stretch and prepare the vessel for another day's journey. The granite monument lies exactly where it was left, wrapped in morning sunlight like a gigantic sunbeam waiting patiently for its next destination. You sit up from your rolled mat and take in the view. Mist floats low across the river. Palm trees rise like silhouettes against the pale sky, and fishermen push narrow reed boats into the water as the first light spreads across the valley. Soon the crew begins their routine. Ropes securing the barge to shore are loosened. The sail is raised gradually to catch the morning breeze. Pilots move to the stern steering oars, scanning the river ahead with the quiet focus of people who know this water like the back of their hands. With a gentle push from long wooden poles, the barge drifts away from the riverbank. The current takes hold once more. You feel the familiar, slow forward glide as the Nile resumes its role as Egypt's most reliable transportation system. The journey north continues. Life aboard the barge has grown pleasantly predictable. Meals are simple, work is steady but unhurried. The river provides constant scenery, an ever-changing scroll of villages, fields, wildlife, and temples slowly drifting past. And of course, the crew never forgets their oversized passenger. Every few hours someone checks the ropes securing the obelisk. Wooden wedges beneath the monument are inspected carefully. If the barge tilts slightly in stronger currents, adjustments are made to keep everything balanced. Even a small shift in weight could stress the wooden deck beams. Historians know that ancient Egyptian cargo ships were capable of remarkable feats of transport. But moving something this heavy still required constant attention. You notice one sailor tapping the wooden supports thoughtfully. Still holding, he mutters. The obelisk offers no reply. Probably the easiest cargo inspection conversation ever conducted. As the sun climbs higher, the river widens slightly and traffic increases. Other boats appear more frequently. Grain barges loaded with sacks, fishing vessels hauling nets, and smaller sailboats carrying travelers between settlements. Several captains slow down as they pass, staring openly at the monument stretched across your deck. One man shades his eyes and calls out across the water. "Where's that going?" A sailor shouts back the name of a temple city further north. The man whistles in appreciation. Transporting obelisks wasn't exactly an everyday event, even in ancient Egypt. Large temple complexes occasionally commissioned them to celebrate a pharaoh's reign or honor a major religious dedication. Each one represented enormous labor, resources, and engineering coordination. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of unveiling a massive public monument. Except instead of shipping it by truck, you floated it down a river behind a square sail. The barge glides onward under the warm midday sun. You lean against the granite surface of the obelisk, which has grown pleasantly warm. The stone holds heat like a giant solar battery. Ancient Egyptians likely noticed this too. Obelisks symbolized sunlight and cosmic order, but they also literally absorbed and reflected the sun's energy throughout the day. That polished pyramidion at the top, once coated in electrum, would shine brilliantly during sunrise and sunset. Historians still debate how reflective those metal-coated tips truly were. Some scholars believe they gleamed like mirrors. Others suspect the effect was subtler, more like a warm golden glow. Either way, travelers approaching a temple would definitely notice. And that, of course, was part of the point. A group of sailors begins preparing the midday meal again: flatbread, dried fish, and dates from a woven basket. One of them jokes that after hauling granite for months, the obelisk probably deserves a share of lunch too. You glance at the stone thoughtfully. If it could talk, it might request a very large portion. As the afternoon drifts onward, the pilots grow slightly more alert. The river ahead narrows between low sandbanks, forcing boats to navigate carefully through the deeper central channel. One pilot points with his steering oar toward a pale patch of water. "Shallow," he says calmly. The sail is adjusted slightly while the barge shifts course by a few meters. It's a delicate maneuver. Running aground would mean stopping the journey, unloading cargo, or waiting for higher water levels. None of those options are appealing when your cargo weighs several hundred tons. Historians still argue how frequently ancient cargo barges encountered these hazards. The Nile's channels changed seasonally, meaning experienced pilots were essential for safe travel. Looking at the careful adjustments being made now, you suspect those pilots earned their pay. The barge glides safely past the sandbank. Crisis politely avoided. Late in the afternoon, the landscape grows greener as irrigation canals branch away from the river into surrounding farmland. Oxen pull water lifting devices called shadifs, long wooden poles with buckets used to raise water from the river into fields. These simple machines allowed farmers to irrigate crops even when floodwaters receded. You watch a farmer operate one rhythmically, lower bucket, lift water, pour into canal, over and over again. The steady motion mirrors the slow rhythm of your journey. The Nile flows, the sail flutters, the obelisk rests. Occasionally the crew shares quiet conversation about the destination temple, how large the courtyard might be, how many workers will gather to raise the monument upright. That final stage will be the most dramatic moment of the entire project. Historians still debate the exact methods Egyptians used to erect obelisks, though ramps and sand-filled pits were likely involved. But that challenge lies further ahead. For now, the monument simply continues its long ride north through the heart of ancient Egypt. By sunset, the river glows deep gold once more. The barge anchors for the night near another quiet bend in the Nile. Sailors tie off the ropes and settle onto the deck as stars begin appearing overhead. You glance at the obelisk one more time before lying down. Millions of years inside the earth. Months of carving. Days of dragging. And now, a peaceful cruise beneath the constellations. Not bad for a giant piece of granite. The river carries you onward the next morning with the same patient determination it has shown for thousands of years. By now the gentle sway of the barge feels almost comforting, like the slow rocking of a cradle made of cedar planks and river water. You've officially adjusted to monument travel speed. The obelisk rests beside you exactly as before, strapped securely to its wooden supports, its long granite body glowing softly in the early sun. The crew has already completed their usual inspections, ropes tightened, wedges checked, and the deck beams listened to carefully for any suspicious creaks. So far, everything remains solid, which is impressive considering the barge is essentially carrying the ancient equivalent of a sideways skyscraper. The Nile widens slightly as the vessel drifts north. The current becomes stronger here, pulling the barge along at a steady pace while the sail catches just enough wind to help guide the direction. But the river is not always perfectly cooperative. Up ahead, the pilots begin exchanging quiet observations. One points toward a stretch of water where the color changes subtly from deep green to a lighter sandy shade. Another scans the surface where tiny ripples form in unusual patterns. These are the signs experienced navigators watch for. Sandbanks. The Nile constantly reshapes its own bed, depositing layers of sand and silt during floods. Over time, these deposits form shallow ridges beneath the surface. For small boats, this might mean a mild inconvenience. For a barge carrying hundreds of tons of granite, it could mean an extremely embarrassing stop in the middle of the river. Historians still argue how ancient pilots mapped these hazards. Some believe they relied on memory and seasonal experience. Others think markers along the riverbanks helped indicate safe channels. Either way, your pilots treat the river like a puzzle they've solved many times before. The steering oars shift slowly. Sailors adjust the sail angle. The barge begins drifting toward the deeper central channel. The obelisk doesn't seem particularly concerned about the maneuver, though one of the sailors pats its side reassuringly. "Don't worry," he says. The monument remains silent, which is probably the most reassuring response possible. As the vessel glides through the tricky stretch of river, the waterline rises slightly along the hull. The sandbank passes harmlessly beneath the surface a few meters away. A quiet success. You notice the crew relax immediately afterward. One man returns to repairing a rope while another adjusts a wooden brace beneath the obelisk. River navigation, like the rest of this project, rewards calm attention rather than dramatic heroics. Still, the Nile occasionally provides surprises. Late in the morning, the wind begins to strengthen slightly from the north. Normally this would help southbound vessels sail upriver. But for your northbound barge it means the sail must be adjusted carefully. Too much wind pushing against the current could slow progress. The crew lowers part of the sail and shifts its angle. The linen cloth flutters loudly for a moment before settling into a smaller, steadier shape. Historians know Egyptian sails were designed to be flexible like this. Sailors could reef or adjust them quickly depending on wind conditions. Ancient river captains may not have used the same nautical vocabulary modern sailors do, but they understood wind and water extremely well. And when your ship carries a priceless monument, it pays to understand both. You move toward the bow of the barge, where the view opens wide across the valley. The Nile curves gently through farmland dotted with small villages. Smoke rises from cooking fires, and farmers walk narrow paths between irrigation canals. In the distance, you spot something new. A temple pylon. The massive gateway towers rise above the trees like a pair of stone mountains framing the horizon. Even from several kilometers away, the structure is unmistakable. Ancient Egyptian temples were designed to dominate the landscape visually. Their tall pylons, courtyards, and towering statues made them visible from great distances. Soon enough, one of those courtyards will host the obelisk resting beside you. A sailor notices you staring toward the temple. "Big place," he says casually. He's not wrong. Temple complexes like those at Karnak or Luxor were enormous, expanding over centuries as successive pharaohs added halls, columns, statues, and obelisks. Historians still debate exactly how many obelisks once stood in these temples during the height of Egyptian civilization. Many have been lost, toppled, or moved across the world in later centuries. But during their original time, they formed glittering stone forests in temple courtyards, pairs of towering monuments marking sacred entrances. Your granite passenger will eventually join that landscape. But not today. The temple slips slowly past along the riverbank as the barge continues northward. The obelisk's destination lies further ahead. Afternoon arrives with bright sunlight reflecting off the water. The crew prepares another simple meal while keeping watch on the river traffic. A convoy of grain barges drifts past heading south, their sails billowing proudly in the wind. Workers aboard those vessels stare curiously at your cargo. One man shouts across the water, "That's a tall one." You glance along the length of the obelisk again. He's not exaggerating. The monument may be lying flat now, but once raised upright it will tower over surrounding buildings. Historians estimate many Egyptian obelisks stood between 20 and 30 meters tall, some even higher, carved from a single block of granite, which is impressive enough to make modern engineers nod with quiet respect. As evening approaches, the river bends gently again, guiding the barge toward another calm anchoring point along the bank. The crew secures the vessel while the sail is lowered for the night. The obelisk remains perfectly still throughout it all. Tomorrow the journey continues. A few more bends in the river. A few more villages drifting past. And eventually, the temple city where hundreds of workers will once again gather, this time to perform the final, astonishing act of raising the monument toward the sky. But for now, the Nile flows softly under the stars, and the granite traveler sleeps peacefully on deck. Morning light spills across the Nile again, soft and golden, as the barge eases away from its overnight anchorage. The crew moves through their now familiar routine with quiet efficiency, loosening ropes, raising the sail, nudging the vessel back into the current with long wooden poles. Your granite companion remains exactly where it has been throughout the journey, stretched across the deck like a sunbathing monument. If the obelisk had emotions, it might be enjoying this very slow river cruise. The current carries the barge northward while the valley gradually grows busier. The villages along the banks appear closer together now, and the river traffic increases as well. Fishing boats, cargo barges, and passenger vessels drift past at different angles, their crews glancing curiously at your very unusual shipment. After all, it's not every day someone floats a stone tower down the Nile. The pilots remain attentive, scanning the water while guiding the barge through the center of the channel. But you notice a subtle change in the atmosphere among the crew. They're starting to look ahead. Not just at the river, at the horizon. Because somewhere beyond the next few bends lies the destination Temple City. You can feel the anticipation building quietly. Transporting the obelisk has been a slow, steady process, but the moment of arrival will involve hundreds of people waiting along the riverbanks, workers, priests, scribes, and curious villagers all gathering to witness the monument's delivery. Ancient Egypt loved a good ceremonial moment, and an obelisk arrival definitely qualifies. As the morning passes, the river bends gently eastward, revealing a wider stretch of farmland. Irrigation canals branch outward like veins from the Nile, feeding green fields filled with wheat and barley. Farmers pause in their work to watch the barge glide by. Word of the monument's journey has likely traveled ahead through river traders and temple messengers. Even in the ancient world, news moved surprisingly fast along the Nile. Big stone coming, someone probably told the next village downstream. Very big stone. Eventually the first hints of the Temple City appear. At first it's just a line of structures rising above the trees, flat-roofed houses made from sun-dried mud brick. Then taller buildings emerge, storage granaries, workshops, and administrative buildings clustered near the river. The city stretches along the fertile banks where farmland meets water. But the real landmark stands further back from the river. Temple pylons. Two enormous stone towers frame the temple entrance, their sloping sides rising above the rooftops like cliffs carved with hieroglyphs. Even from this distance, they dominate the skyline. The sailors notice them too. One points with his chin toward the horizon. Almost there. You follow his gaze. Between the pylons you can just glimpse the temple courtyard beyond, an open space where priests conduct rituals and pharaohs celebrate victories. And where, very soon, a new obelisk will stand. Historians know that temple complexes across Egypt frequently expanded over centuries. Pharaohs added new courtyards, statues, columns, and monuments as acts of devotion to the gods, and as very visible reminders of their own power. Erecting an obelisk was one of the most dramatic additions a ruler could commission. The monument represented divine connection, royal authority, and engineering skill all at once. It also made for an excellent skyline feature. As the barge approaches the city's river docks, activity along the shoreline increases rapidly. Workers gather near the stone quays built for loading cargo. Some carry ropes and wooden beams. Others bring sledges similar to the one used at the quarry. Clearly, the unloading operation has been planned in advance. You can see overseers gesturing energetically while scribes take notes nearby. Even a few priests in bright white linen robes stand watching the river, waiting for the vessel to arrive. The barge slows as sailors adjust the sail and steering oars. Smaller escort boats move alongside to help guide the heavy vessel toward the dock. This maneuver requires careful coordination. A barge carrying several hundred tons of granite does not stop on a dime. The pilots angle the hull gradually while long poles push against the riverbed to steer the bow toward the quay. The obelisk shifts slightly on its wooden braces as the barge turns. But the ropes hold firm. Slowly, carefully, the vessel glides alongside the dock. Ropes are thrown ashore. Workers on land secure them to thick wooden posts embedded in the stone quay. The barge settles into place. A quiet murmur spreads through the crowd gathered along the riverbank. There it is, the obelisk that began its journey in the granite quarries far to the south, now resting only a few meters from the temple city that will claim it. You step to the edge of the deck and look out across the gathering workers. Hundreds of people have assembled to watch the unloading. Some will help pull the sled again. Others will guide the monument through the streets or along prepared paths toward the temple courtyard. Because the journey isn't quite finished yet. The river has delivered the obelisk safely. But now the final stage begins. Getting the giant stone from the barge back onto land, without letting gravity stage a dramatic finale. The crew begins preparing the unloading ramp, thick wooden beams laid carefully between the deck and the stone quay. It looks very familiar. In fact, it's almost identical to the ramp used earlier to load the monument onto the vessel. Sliding, once again, will save the day. Workers position ropes along the sled while priests step forward to offer brief prayers and sprinkle water across the ramp. Even after all this careful planning, a little divine encouragement never hurts. You glance back at the granite pillar resting across the deck. The Nile journey is complete. But the final act, raising this monument toward the sun, still lies ahead. And judging by the crowd gathering along the quay, everyone in the city wants to see how it's done. The river dock buzzes with quiet excitement as workers gather around the barge. The obelisk rests exactly where it has been throughout the journey, long, silent, and unimaginably heavy, but now the entire focus of the crowd turns toward it. Because unloading something this large from a boat is not a casual afternoon task. It's more like a carefully choreographed performance involving ropes, wood, patience, and several hundred people hoping gravity behaves politely. You stand near the edge of the barge while workers finish building the unloading ramp. Thick wooden beams are laid between the deck and the stone quay, forming a gradual slope. Mud and damp sand are packed along the planks to create traction and reduce friction. The setup looks familiar. In fact, it's almost exactly the reverse of the loading process you watched days ago by the riverbank near the quarry. Sliding the obelisk off the barge will rely on the same simple principle that has carried the monument this far: controlled movement. Lots of ropes, and steady teamwork. The sled that once dragged the obelisk across desert sand has already been prepared again. Workers guide it carefully beneath the stone, adjusting wooden supports until the monument rests securely on the platform. It feels strangely comforting to see the old sled again, like meeting a reliable travel companion who has returned to escort the granite passenger for the next stage of its trip. Nearby, overseers move through the crowd giving instructions while scribes jot notes onto papyrus scrolls. Everything is recorded. Labor teams, tools issued, supplies delivered. Ancient Egypt may have loved monumental architecture, but it loved administrative organization almost as much. One scribe pauses, glances at the obelisk, and shakes his head slightly before writing another line. You suspect he's calculating how many workers will complain about their backs tomorrow. Meanwhile, the priests conduct a brief ritual beside the ramp. One scatters incense while another pours water along the wooden planks. To modern eyes, it might look ceremonial. To ancient Egyptians, it's both practical and spiritual. The water helps reduce friction, while the prayer politely invites the gods to avoid any sudden disasters involving enormous granite objects. Historians still debate how deeply workers believed divine protection was necessary during projects like this. But considering the risks involved, it's easy to understand why no one objected to a little extra cosmic assistance. Finally, the foreman raises his staff. The signal spreads quickly through the crowd. Pulling teams gather along the ropes attached to the sled. Workers along the sides grip long wooden poles, ready to guide and stabilize the monument as it begins to move. The ramp lies ahead like a wooden bridge between river and land. You feel a small ripple of tension pass through the crowd. Even after days of successful transport, this moment still requires precision. If the sled slides too quickly, the obelisk could slam into the quay. Too slowly, and the monument might stall halfway down the ramp. The foreman shouts. The ropes tighten. And once again, the giant stone begins to move. The sled creaks softly as it inches toward the ramp. Sand shifts beneath the runners while workers pour water along the planks. Step by careful step, the monument advances. The front runners reach the ramp first. Wood groans under the weight as the sled begins descending toward the dock. Gravity assists now, but gravity is also the thing everyone is slightly nervous about. Workers along the sides lean their poles against the sled, controlling the speed of the descent. Others hold ropes behind the platform to slow its movement. It's less like pulling now and more like carefully lowering a sleeping giant down a staircase. The obelisk glides halfway down the ramp. Everything pauses. Foremen inspect the alignment. Sailors check the barge's balance. Workers hammer wedges behind the runners to keep the sled from moving while adjustments are made. The crowd waits quietly. You can almost hear everyone collectively thinking the same thing. Please keep sliding nicely. After a few moments, the signal is given again. The wedges are removed. The ropes tighten. And the sled continues its slow descent. Finally, the front runners reach the stone quay. The obelisk slides off the ramp and settles fully onto land. A soft cheer spreads through the workers. The most delicate part of the unloading process is finished. The monument now rests securely on the dock, surrounded by ropes, poles, and dozens of very relieved laborers. You glance back at the barge that carried it here. The vessel floats noticeably higher in the water now, freed from its enormous burden. Sailors immediately begin loosening the support beams and tidying the deck. Their job is complete. But the monument's journey continues. The temple courtyard still lies several hundred meters away from the river. And just like before, the sled will carry the obelisk across prepared ground using the same combination of ropes, damp sand, and teamwork. Workers quickly reorganize the pulling teams. The crowd shifts aside as the path toward the temple entrance is cleared. You look ahead toward the towering pylons rising above the city. Between them lies the courtyard where the obelisk will eventually stand upright, pointing toward the sun. For now, though, it's still lying flat on its faithful wooden sled. The foreman raises his staff once more. The ropes tighten again, and the monument begins its final land journey, slowly sliding away from the Nile that carried it here, toward the temple that has been waiting patiently for its arrival. The sled moves forward again with the familiar rhythm that everyone now understands. Ropes tighten, sand shifts, wood creaks softly, and the obelisk glides a few careful inches across the ground. The path from the river to the temple has already been prepared long before the barge arrived. Workers spent days leveling the earth, removing stones, and spreading thick layers of damp sand across the route. It looks almost like a sandy road, though far smoother than the surrounding streets. Ancient Egyptian engineers understood something simple but powerful. Wet sand reduces friction dramatically. Pouring water ahead of the sled makes the grains cling together, creating a firmer surface that allows heavy objects to slide more easily. Modern experiments have confirmed this little trick works remarkably well, which means the workers ahead of the sled carry jars of water not for drinking, but for the ground. Every few steps they splash water across the sand. The sled glides forward. Then they splash again. It's a surprisingly calm process for something involving a 70-ton block of granite. As the convoy advances through the city, residents gather along the sides of the route to watch. Children sit on walls. Merchants pause their trading. A few donkeys stare at the enormous stone as if wondering why humans feel the need to move mountains through the streets. The obelisk's polished sides catch the sunlight. Even lying horizontally, it feels impressive. Once upright, it will tower over everything around it. Priests walk beside the monument carrying small incense burners. Thin curls of smoke drift into the warm air while quiet prayers are murmured along the route. The obelisk is more than architecture. It is a sacred object connected to the sun god and to the pharaoh himself. Its arrival at the temple is treated almost like the arrival of a royal guest. And, in a sense, it is. Along the route, workers pause occasionally to rest the pulling teams. Wedges are hammered behind the sled to keep it from sliding backward. People stretch their arms. Water jars are refilled. Scribes continue their steady documentation of everything. One of them quietly notes how many workers rotated out of the pulling teams. Another records the progress made since the monument left the dock. Ancient Egypt ran on paperwork just as much as pyramids. Eventually, the temple pylons grow larger ahead. Their massive walls frame the entrance to the courtyard where the obelisk will finally be raised upright. But raising it is a challenge entirely different from transporting it. Moving a giant stone horizontally is one thing. Standing it vertically, without cranes, steel cables, or hydraulic machinery, is something else entirely. Engineers have proposed several methods the Egyptians may have used. One of the most widely accepted ideas involves building a large earthen ramp beside the future location of the obelisk. The sled would be dragged partway up the ramp, positioning the base of the monument directly above a prepared stone socket in the ground. Then, through a careful system of ropes, sand pits, and controlled lowering, the obelisk could gradually pivot downward into an upright position. It sounds complicated, but ancient builders were remarkably good at turning simple materials, sand, rope, wood, and gravity, into elegant engineering solutions. For now, though, the workers are focused on reaching the courtyard. The sled slides past the temple gate. Massive stone statues watch silently as the monument enters the sacred space. The courtyard is wide and open, with the foundations of another obelisk already standing nearby. This one was raised years earlier, and it rises gracefully into the sky like a giant stone needle. Soon, the new obelisk will stand beside it as its twin. Workers guide the sled toward the prepared ramp. From a distance it looks like a small hill made of packed earth. Wooden beams reinforce its sides, and ropes lie coiled neatly at the top. Everything has been prepared in advance. Everything has been measured. Everything is ready. The foreman signals the pulling teams again. The sled begins climbing the ramp slowly, inch by inch. This part of the journey may actually be the most physically demanding. Gravity is no longer helping. Now the workers must pull the enormous stone upward. But they have done harder things before. The ropes tighten. Voices rise in steady rhythm. The sled climbs. Halfway up the ramp, the workers pause again. Wedges are placed behind the runners. Water is poured over the sand to keep it compact. The monument rests quietly, as if enjoying a brief moment to admire the temple courtyard before its final transformation. Because soon, this long sleeping giant will stand up for the first time. And once it does, it will remain standing for centuries. Watching the sunrise. Watching empires rise and fall. Watching the Nile continue its slow and patient flow beside the city. But first, the workers must finish climbing the ramp. The foreman raises his staff. The ropes tighten once more. And the obelisk inches closer to the top. At the top of the ramp, the workers move more slowly than ever. The obelisk now rests on its sled just a short distance from the place where it will finally stand upright. The air feels quieter here, even though hundreds of people remain nearby. Everyone understands that the next steps require patience. Not strength, not speed, just careful control. The engineers and foremen gather around the prepared stone socket in the courtyard floor. This socket is a deep, carefully carved hole designed to hold the base of the obelisk once it stands upright. Its sides are smooth and precisely shaped to fit the monument's base almost perfectly. It took weeks to prepare. After all, if the obelisk tilts even slightly once raised, fixing it would be extremely inconvenient. The sled is guided so that the base of the obelisk hangs directly above this socket. But for now, the stone still lies flat along the ramp. Beside the ramp sits something that looks surprisingly ordinary. A large pit filled with sand. At first glance it might resemble a construction site storage area, but this sand pit plays one of the most important roles in the entire raising process. Because sand, when controlled carefully, behaves almost like a slow-motion liquid. Ancient Egyptian engineers understood that by gradually removing sand from beneath an object, they could lower it with remarkable precision. It's a clever solution that replaces complicated machinery with something simple and reliable. Gravity does the work. Sand controls the speed. Workers begin setting up the ropes. Dozens of thick ropes are looped around the upper portion of the obelisk and anchored to wooden posts and pulling teams positioned behind the ramp. These ropes will act as stabilizers, preventing the monument from tipping too quickly as it begins to pivot. Others position wooden beams along the sides, creating guiding supports. Everything looks calm, but everyone is concentrating very hard. The foreman inspects the alignment one last time. The base of the obelisk is perfectly positioned above the socket. The sand pit is ready. The ropes are tight. The ramp slopes downward behind the monument. He raises his staff. Workers at the sand pit begin their job first. Using baskets and wooden shovels, they slowly remove small amounts of sand from beneath the rear of the obelisk. At first, nothing happens. Then, almost imperceptibly, the massive stone begins to move. The back end sinks slightly. The front end, positioned above the socket, starts to lift. A quiet murmur passes through the watching crowd. This is the moment where the monument begins its slow transformation from horizontal traveler to vertical guardian. More sand is removed. The rear lowers further into the pit. The obelisk pivots gently, like the slow hand of a giant clock. The ropes tighten as pulling teams lean backward to keep everything steady. No one rushes. Every movement is measured. Workers remove another layer of sand. The angle increases. Now the obelisk is tilted noticeably upward, pointing toward the sky at a gradual incline. From this angle, its carvings catch the sunlight in a completely new way. Hieroglyphs that were once horizontal now begin to climb toward the heavens. More sand is removed. The monument continues rising. Wooden beams creak softly as they guide the stone's sides, preventing any sideways movement. The ropes hold firm. Another pause. Foreman checked the alignment again. The base still hovers perfectly above the socket. Everything remains under control. The workers resume. More sand disappears into baskets. The pit grows deeper, and the obelisk rises higher. Now it stands at a steep angle, perhaps halfway between lying down and standing upright. From this position, it finally begins to look like the towering monument it will soon become. The crowd grows very quiet. Even the workers pulling the ropes speak only in soft commands. Because at this stage, the weight of the stone is shifting dramatically. Gravity is trying harder and harder to pull it downward into its final position. Which is exactly what they want. Just, not too quickly. Another layer of sand is removed. The rear end sinks further. The obelisk rises higher still. Soon, very soon, the base will begin to drop into the socket prepared below. And once that happens, the final moments of the raising process will begin. The foreman watches closely. The workers at the pit slow their digging. Only a little more sand remains beneath the rear of the monument. The ropes tighten again. The obelisk tilts just a little further toward the sky. The base edges closer to the socket. Everyone waits, because the next movement will decide everything. For a few long moments, nothing moves. The obelisk hangs at its steep angle above the courtyard, supported by ropes, wooden guides, and the careful balance of gravity and sand. Hundreds of eyes are fixed on the monument. Even the workers holding the ropes seem to breathe a little slower. At this stage, precision matters more than strength. The foreman lowers his staff slightly, signaling the workers at the sandpit to continue. Very slowly, basket by basket, a thin layer of sand is removed from beneath the rear of the obelisk. The back sinks just a little deeper. The front rises a little higher. Then, almost gently, the base of the obelisk begins to descend into the stone socket below. A quiet murmur ripples through the courtyard. The moment everyone has been waiting for has arrived. The base settles a few inches into the socket. Workers pause immediately. Foremen inspect the alignment again, walking carefully around the base while peering into the narrow gap between stone and socket walls. Everything appears perfectly centered. The signal is given again. The sand removal continues. Another small layer disappears. The rear end of the monument sinks lower into the pit. The obelisk pivots further upright. The base slides deeper into the socket. Now gravity begins helping the process more noticeably. The monument wants to stand upright. The workers' ropes keep it from doing so too quickly. Pulling teams lean backward, controlling the speed of the pivot like sailors managing the sail of a ship in strong wind. The ropes creak. Wooden supports groan softly. But everything holds. Another pause. More inspection. The base is now halfway seated inside the socket. From this angle, the obelisk towers above the workers below. Even though it's not fully upright yet, it already dominates the courtyard. The hieroglyphs carved along its sides stretch skyward like vertical lines of sunlight frozen in stone. Priests quietly burn incense near the base, whispering prayers to the sun god. For them, the moment carries deep symbolic meaning. An obelisk represents a ray of the sun, solidified light connecting the heavens to the earth. Watching it rise from the ground must feel like witnessing a sacred transformation. The workers at the sandpit remove another layer. The rear sinks deeper. The monument rises again. Now the obelisk stands almost upright. The ropes behind it are nearly vertical, holding it steady like the strings of a giant instrument. Only a small amount of sand remains beneath the rear. The base settles deeper into its socket. Foremen examine the gap again. Still perfectly aligned. Still steady. The signal is given for the final stage. The remaining sand is removed very slowly. Basket. Pause. Basket. Pause. With each removal, the obelisk inches closer to its final position. Then, with a soft grinding sound of stone meeting stone, the base slides fully into the socket. The monument reaches its upright position. For a second, the ropes hold tension as everyone waits to see if the obelisk will remain stable. It does. The ropes gradually loosen. The wooden guides are pulled away. And there, standing tall in the temple courtyard, is the finished obelisk. A 70-ton column of granite rising proudly toward the sky. The crowd erupts into cheers. Workers clap each other on the shoulders. Some simply sit down in the sand, exhausted but smiling. The priests raise their incense burners toward the monument as sunlight gleams along its polished sides. The journey from quarry to temple is complete. What began as a massive block of stone carved from the cliffs of Aswan has become a towering monument dedicated to the gods and the pharaoh. And now that it stands upright, it will likely remain here for centuries, watching seasons change, dynasties rise, and generations of visitors pass through the courtyard below. You take a final look up at the obelisk. Its pointed top glows in the warm sunlight. It's hard to believe that just days ago it was sliding slowly across sand, resting on a wooden sled beside the Nile. Ancient engineering often seems mysterious from the distance of history. But when you watch each step unfold, the ropes, the sand, the teamwork, it begins to feel less like magic and more like quiet patience. Patience strong enough to lift a mountain, and strong enough to leave a monument that still points toward the sun thousands of years later.